At the British Institute of Human Rights, our mission is to create social justice through human rights advocacy and approaches. Our aim at BIHR is a shared aim with the aim of our Human Rights Act, which is to create a culture of respect for human rights across the UK. Parliament's Joint Committee on Human Rights explained a culture of respect for human rights as a culture which fosters basic respect for human rights and creates a climate in which such respect becomes an integral part of our way of life and a reference point for our dealing with public authorities and each other. We work to create this change together with people, community advocacy and campaigning groups, staff working in public bodies, and decision makers. Our Human Rights Act is central to everything we do at BIHR as we strive for social justice across the UK. It is a crucial piece of legislation which, when understood and implemented, has the power, more so than any other single piece of legislation, in our opinion, to move us towards a society in which everyone is treated with dignity, respect, and without discrimination. On the 14th of December 2021, the UK Government published a report by the Independent Human Rights Act Review, and alongside the report, they released a new consultation paper setting out that they plan to replace our Human Rights Act with a Bill of Rights. This has caused widespread concern and frustration across civil society in the UK for many reasons. Widespread frustration because it appears that our government has largely ignored its own independent review into our Human Rights Act. And rather than reflecting on the evidence provided by thousands of people and organisations, the Ministry of Justice has instead released a consultation which proposes not amending our Human Rights Act, which is what the review looked into, but instead replacing it with a Bill of Rights. Put simply, the government intends to largely ignore a public consultation and the recommendations of a panel of independent experts put together by the government itself, and instead appears to be basing the case for reform on the same arguments the new Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, put forward in his 2009 book, An Assault on Liberty. This has caused widespread concern because the government is suggesting rewriting the law which sets rules on the power of the state and provides minimum standards for how people should be treated when interacting with the state, as well as domestic legal remedy when this doesn't happen. That is what our Human Rights Act does. At BIHR, we are hugely concerned about this week's announcements. In response to the publication of the Independent Human Rights Act Review and the UK Government's consultation papers proposing replacing our Human Rights Act with a UK Bill of Rights, we at BIHR have put together a 5-part action plan. Firstly, we will help our 4 key groups to understand what's happening. Knowledge is power. This is important because the government's plans for reform of our Human Rights Act, a piece of legislation which impacts every single one of us, were published in a consultation paper on the 14th of December. A date in the lead up to winter holidays and a date when people and public services deal with a public health crisis with rapidly increasing COVID cases. A date when human rights campaigners struggle to contend with a raft of concerning legal changes, such as the Nationality and Borders Bill and the Police Sentencing in Courts Bill. If the government's intention is really to consult with people, it's hard to see how their timing could be any worse. We want to support people to understand what's happening in accessible ways so that they can make their own mind up about the government's plans and have their voices heard in the government's consultation. We've therefore prepared lots of new resources, including a short explainer on what's happened and how we got here, and a short explainer on what the independent report and consultation say. The second part of our action plan involves us continuing to help our 4 key groups to understand how the Human Rights Act works. We've been greatly concerned with some of the evidence for Human Rights Act reform explained by government ministers, most notably our Justice Secretary Dominic Raab. Writing in the Times newspaper and speaking in the House of Commons on Tuesday the 14th of December, Raab again relied on a specific immigration case from over a decade ago in making his case for reform of our Human Rights Act. He left out the fact that the law has since changed and the problem he refers to has been fixed. In the House of Commons this week, Rab also focused on our right to freedom of expression, which is Article 10 of our Human Rights Act and our European Convention on Human Rights. He said that the right to freedom of expression is weighted towards preventing expression and stops us from saying things simply because others don't want to hear them. This is not how our Human Rights Act works. And like so many with power who attack the law, these kinds of statements rely on the public and others to not have the knowledge of how qualified rights work and the confidence to challenge. We want to support people to understand how our Human Rights Act works, to empower people across the UK to challenge misinformation with knowledge, confidence and evidence. We've therefore created lots of new resources about our Human Rights Act and are resharing lots of our existing relevant resources, such as our Human Rights Act Information Hub, our What Rights Do I Have Hub, which includes plain language and easy read explainers of each of our 16 rights covered by the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights, and a fact checker, which will be coming soon. Part 3 of our action plan is to bring together our 4 key groups to learn, discuss and plan joint campaigning. We plan to run a series of workshops bringing together our 4 key groups: people, communities, staff working for public bodies and policy professionals, to get people up to speed on what's happened, why it matters, and how you can ensure your voice is heard in the Human Rights Act reform consultation. We will run these workshops in the new year. We'd love to deliver these with partners, combining expertise and networks. We're actively welcoming organisations who share our goals to support this upskilling, to work with us to deliver this workshop. Please get in touch with us. And to attend a workshop, please register your interest here. Part 4 of our action plan is to continue to gather and share stories about why our Human Rights Act matters. When asked about the drivers for Human Rights Act reform on Tuesday the 14th, Justice Secretary Dominic Raab explained that the driver was people of this country who are fed up with the Act being misused to protect dangerous foreign criminals. He went on to talk about the burden of positive obligation that the Act puts on public bodies to protect rights. Our experience at BIHR, working directly with over 4,000 people, community groups and public bodies in 2021 alone, is that this isn't the case. People, communities and policy professionals value our Human Rights Act as a powerful legal as well as an advocacy tool for ensuring the policy and delivery of public services respects and protects rights. Public bodies themselves value our Human Rights Act as a practical decision-making tool to help them make rights-respecting decisions every day. The Independent Human Rights Act Review, the report the government was to base this consultation on, sets this out in no uncertain terms. The Independent Human Rights Act Review told the government that the vast majority of submissions received by the panel spoke strongly in support of the Human Rights Act. They pointed to its impact in improving public administration for individuals through developing a human rights culture. And the panel asked that the Human Rights Act was not just, to be viewed through the prism of a few high-profile cases, or indeed with a focus on litigation at all. Indeed, since the government's announcements, we've seen nothing but resistance to the plans from civil society across the UK. Responses from Scottish human rights organisations who are uniting to reject unnecessary, regressive and divisive plans to replace the Human Rights Act. Organisations across Northern Ireland civil society who have criticised dangerous UK government plans to reform human rights, as well as multiple other UK civil society organisations and 159 organisations who signed our letter just days before on Human Rights Day, asking the government to protect our rights. We will continue to amplify these voices with decision makers, importantly with MPs when the time comes to vote on any bill to reform our IHRA, our Human Rights Act. You can read and share why the Human Rights Act matters for people like Kirsten and Ian, who used the Act to advocate for change in their loved ones' care and support, for Rani in campaigning to end violence against women and girls, for Danielle in her work to empower, support and advocate for all lesbian and bisexual women and their families, for Kamena in ensuring children's rights, for social workers like Daisy and mental health nurses like Paul. You can join our campaign, write us a blog or send us a picture, telling us why the Act matters to you. You can read their voices and more here. And part 5 of our action plan around Human Rights Act reform is that we will submit our own response to the government's consultation, which amplifies the voices of the people we work with. We want to support people and organisations to submit their own responses. However, we also understand the pressures on civil society and that responding to continuous reviews and inquiries without time, resource, or accountability on the part of those running reviews creates its own challenges. At the start of next year, we will begin running an engagement campaign to gather your views on the government's Human Rights Act consultation, which we will include in our response. We will do this through partnership events, accessible surveys, interactive tools, and workshops. If you'd like to be involved, you can take action now and join us. Sign up to our campaign list and be the first to support our upcoming actions to show political leaders why our Human Rights Act matters.